Hello, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of Texas National Security Review. Today we'll be hearing from James Steinberg, who will talk in detail about his experience observing the Northern Ireland peace process. This builds on the article that he wrote in Volume 2, Issue 3 of Texas National Security Review, available online at tnsr.org, and his remarks were recorded as part of the University of Texas Clements Center's summer seminar on history, diplomacy, and statecraft.
So my topic today is about the Northern Ireland peace process leading to the Good Friday Agreement. And I want to give you just a little background for why I decided to do this piece. It was prompted by two parallel reasons. The first was I was asked as a part of a little project that was being done by RAND by a group of people who were thinking about the Afghan peace process, which is now taking place, to think about whether there were lessons learned from other peace processes. And so I was asked, because of my own personal involvement in Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland peace process, to do a paper for them on that. And so my initial work was very much focused on thinking about whether there were lessons learned there. And I'll come back to this during the course of my talk, but of course, the whole question about whether you can learn lessons from one historical set of events, one set of policy problems, and apply it to another is an interesting and complex question, which many people here have reflected on a lot, including Philip and our mutual mentor, Ernest May. But the second reason I wanted to write the piece is because it's now 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement was concluded. And as those of you who follow it know, the status of that agreement is in deep trouble right now because of events both in Northern Ireland itself and because of the broader issues, particularly around Brexit, that raise the question about whether the agreements that were reached 20 years ago can be sustained today, and whether the achievement was a temporary one, or whether it really fundamentally transformed things in a way that would prevent violence from reoccurring. So for both of those reasons, plus just my own desire to go back and re-immerse myself in something that was an incredibly powerful experience in my own life, led me to want to spend some time back reflecting on the peace process. And I came to the question with four of the different hats that I wear in my own life and in my own career. The first, of course, is a practitioner. I had been deeply involved initially in the early 1980s when I worked for Senator Kennedy, who had been involved in some of the early stages of the peace process, particularly with John Hume and the Four Horsemen on the Hill, who were American members of Congress who had a lot of interest in Northern Ireland. And then later, during the Clinton administration, first when I was at the State Department, and then and much more intensively after 1996, in the White House, where I had the privilege of working with the President and George Mitchell, actually on the ground in the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement. So I had my practitioner's hat. I have my hat as a half-card-carrying member of the political science community that certainly many of my colleagues in international relations and conflict studies think about Northern Ireland. It has become one of the poster child cases in the political science of conflict management and conflict resolution, and work very closely with a number of people at Maxwell who we have a particular interest in conflict management and conflict prevention. So that was the second hat. The third hat, again, as I said, is a historian and thinking about this problem from a historian's perspective. And finally, as you heard a preview of, my hat as a gardener. And I will explain to you why my hat as a gardener mattered. But for in each of these hats, the core question that I really was interested in was the question of agency, which was how much was this a problem that could be understood in the framework of thinking about choice and individual leaders bringing about a result, and how much should we think about this in terms of structural forces that brought about the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland? Because each of these hats, each of these perspectives come to the question of agency and determinism from very different, they're all very interested in the question, but they come at it in very different ways. For the practitioner, the issue, agency is baked into the blood. You wouldn't be a practitioner if you didn't think what you did made a difference. Right? I mean, it's just, why would you do it? It's not the most wonderful, rewarding life to be in, right? Doesn't pay well. People don't treat you nicely. The offices are not that good. You don't get a lot of support. And at the end of the day, people just blame you for everything that happens. So you have to believe that there's a reason to do it and that you can make a difference. So almost by definition, if you didn't believe in agency, you wouldn't be a practitioner. For the political scientist, the issue of agency is much more difficult, especially in international relations, as we've been talking about here, and you all spent a lot of time thinking about. The whole goal of much of political science is to develop theories that are both descriptive and predictive, that are based on a relatively parsimonious view about a set of factors that produce results, and that agency introduces an element of contingency, uncertainty, unpredictability that makes the political scientist uncomfortable, which is not to say that there aren't political scientists like my colleague Peg Herman, who study leadership, or Michael Horowitz, who's written about the role of individuals and the like. But in the political science community, there's just this tension about the desire for parsimonious predictive theory and coping with how do you account for agency. For historians, it's kind of mixed. I mean, many of you are more schooled in the history of historical methodology than I, but there really are two different views in the historians community. One, which is kind of a highly narrative, thick history view of the role of the historian, which tends to give a large place to the role of individual actors. If you think about the great stories, the great historical accounts that focus on presidents and generals and the like, there is a kind of vividness about the story and the narrative that places individuals in a prominent role. But we also have historians who are social historians and economic historians who look at structural forces as well. And so for the historians, the role of agency can be very fundamental or less important depending on your overall approach to the profession. To the gardener has many of the similarities of the practitioner, which is that every year you go out and you plant your garden with the belief that what you do will make a difference in terms of whether your garden will produce anything. And like the practitioner, this is often a reflection of hope triumphing over experience. And that, as Kennan himself wrote when he described policy planning as an exercise in gardening, that it's a little bit like the experience of Job, which is you're constantly trying to overcome obstacles which are being constantly thrown in front of you. And there's a lot of reason to believe as a gardener that it's all hopeless between the weather and the bugs and the diseases and everything else and the deer. But nonetheless, you go out and try to make a difference because you believe that there's something that you can do, building a higher fence, finding a different fertilizer, whatever, that will somehow produce a better result than you produced in the past. So turning now to the question of Northern Ireland, it's a wonderful case because, for the most part, when we study the question about agency versus determinism, it's very hard to get a hold of the question of how would you know, right? It's a deeply counterfactual set of arguments that have to be made. You say, would these different things make a difference? Would different choices, would different individuals have made a difference? And we've got a lot of learning, there's a lot of political scientists who've written about the question of how do you construct a good counterfactual, how do you evaluate a good counterfactual, but there's no definitive answer to the question about these. And the beauty of most counterfactual argumentation, especially in the world of practice, is you can make counterfactual assertions that are heroic and can never be disproven. Well, if only you'd done this, everything would have been great, right? And how do you disprove it, right? There's no opportunity, unlike for natural science, where you can go into the laboratory and rerun the experiment. But the beautiful thing about the Northern Ireland case is that it offered what is in some ways the most compelling of the not entirely compelling strategies for doing counterfactual analysis, which is the possibility of an in-case comparison. Because during the course of the Troubles, which began in 1969 and presumably ended with the Good Friday Agreement, there had been multiple opportunities and multiple efforts to bring the conflict to an end. And the earlier ones had failed, and the one in 1998 succeeded. So there was an opportunity to look at the question about why had previous efforts failed and why had the 1998 one succeeded, and could one isolate the factors that had changed between 1969, or most importantly, the first serious effort to resolve the problem in 1973 and 1998 to try to judge, whether it was individuals' choices, economic factors, political factors, the weather, whatever, that made a difference. And what made this especially kind of nice as a thought experiment is a quite now well-known remark by one of the participants in the negotiations who'd been involved from the beginning. And as those of you who had a chance to look at my article, you'll know that in 1973 there was a serious effort to resolve the crisis. The violence had broken out in 1969, had become fairly intense by 1973. And there was an effort by the British government and the semi-autonomous government in Northern Ireland to bring a resolution of the crisis through the so-called Sunningdale's Agreement, which was an attempt to solve the problem of the tensions between the Protestant and Catholic communities in Northern Ireland through a power-sharing agreement. And the agreement that was reached in 1973, the Sunningdale's Agreement, was extraordinarily similar in its form to the final agreement that was reached in 1998. There are differences in detail, and some people would argue those differences were consequential. My own view is that it was incredibly similar. But more importantly, Seamus Mallon, who was a Catholic nationalist politician who'd been involved in the process from the beginning, said at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, when asked to explain the outcome of the Good Friday Agreement, was that he said that the Good Friday Agreement was Sunningdale for slow learners, basically arguing that we had all these pieces in place in 1973. It just took a long time for people to see the light. And the implication of Seamus's observation in some respects was, well, if we'd had faster learners in 1973, we would have avoided 25 years of violence and troubles. And that, of course, the faster learners suggest that it was the individuals involved who didn't have the wisdom at the time in 1973, 1974 to see that this was the way out. And it took the people either more time to learn or the emergence of new learners by 1998 to bring about the agreement. So it really seemed to frame the question and allowed us to ask the counterfactual was, well, is it the case? Had there been, if there were faster learners, if there were people who understood this better, who had the wisdom, the leadership, or whatever, to make these judgments, to go with the Sunningdale's Agreement in 1974, could this all have been avoided? And so that's what I wanted to explore in the article and my own examination, and to look at the question about whether we could construct a counterfactual that said, if David Trimble had been around in 1974, if Gerry Adams had been in a leadership position in 1974, if Tony Blair had been the prime minister in 1974, if Bill Clinton had been the president of the United States in 1974, would the agreement have come about at that time in the way that it did in 1998? And as I suggest in the article, there are powerful reasons to believe that that's just not the case. That there were lots of things that changed between 1973 and 1973, 74, and 1998 that made it possible for the agreement to be reached and sustained in 1998 that just couldn't have been done there. This was not a failure of Brian Faulkner's leadership. It wasn't that Faulkner was a less good leader of the Unionists than Trimble, or that the nationalists who were involved in making the agreement, the Catholic nationalists in 73, or that the British politicians, the prime ministers of the time, were any less committed to it. That there were a number of factors, and I discuss in the article a whole range of things that had happened over time that made the agreement that were not present in 73, 74, that were present in 98, beginning with the changing demographics in Northern Ireland, in which it's a process that obviously predates even the Troubles themselves, but the higher birth rates among Catholics in Northern Ireland compared to the Protestants, which was changing the demographic mix, which meant that even if you had decision-making by consent in Northern Ireland by just popular vote, that over time, the Catholics were going to become at the same level and ultimately a larger percentage of the population than the Protestants. The changes in the economics in Northern Ireland through much of the 20th century, Northern Ireland was far more prosperous than the Irish Republic, but for a variety of reasons, some of having to do with changes in economic policy in the Republic of Ireland, some having to do with Ireland's joining the European Union in 1973. The economy of the Republic of Ireland took off, and at the same time, changes in manufacturing in the developed world caused a decline in the economy in Northern Ireland. So rather than seeing Northern Ireland as a undesirable partner, the Republic of Ireland is an undesirable partner for the North. All of a sudden, economic relations between the two became more attractive for the business community in Northern Ireland and the like. So you had economic factors that had changed. You had changes in the policy of the British government. Some of the observers and people who've written about this focus on the fact that as the British changed their approach to security policy from having the British Army provide security in Northern Ireland to using indigenous Northern Ireland forces, it became harder for the IRA to treat the security force as an occupying army, as an imperialist army, and that in order to continue a campaign of violence, they were having to kill other Northern Irelanders rather than this intruding British army. As another factor, so you had a variety of developments that took place over this time that over the 25-year period, all of which made much more conducive to reaching an agreement in 1998. So I think Malin was wrong. It wasn't just the absence of fast learners in 1973. But again, that doesn't still answer the question of agency, because one question is, could different leaders have made an agreement along the lines of the Good Friday Agreement in 73? My answer is not likely. But the question is still, had there been different leaders in 98, would we still have gotten the agreement? That's the other side of the agency question, which is the circumstances may have been more propitious in 1998, but does that mean that the agreement was inevitable? And again, my answer is no, that actually, even though the circumstances were more propitious in 1998, that there are reasons to believe that the individual characters played a significant role in bringing about the agreement. And I focus on a couple of them in particular. I think one of the most important was the two individuals who became the leaders of Sinn Féin and the IRA during this period, and their ability to, on the one hand, see the advantages for the nationalist community for reaching an agreement, but also the fact that they had spent a lifetime developing credibility with the so-called hard men within the IRA and the Republican movement that allowed them to both make the agreement, but also to persuade the people who are going to be most skeptical within the Republican movement to go along with it, and that other leaders of the IRA, plausible leaders of the IRA and Sinn Féin, who could well have been at the table at that time, would not likely have been willing to make the deal or have been able to sell the deal. But this is a harder case to make on the agency, because if you look on the Unionist side, for example, a lot of attention has been given to David Trimble, the head of the Unionist Party. After all, he shared the Nobel Prize for reaching the agreement. But interestingly enough, within a year and a half after the agreement was reached, Trimble was ousted as the leader of the Unionist Party, and the Unionists ceased becoming the majority, or I guess majority is the right word, Unionist Party. And so the Unionist leadership within the consociational power sharing agreement switched to the DUP. And ironically, it was Ian Paisley, the most hardline of the Unionists, who became the first minister under the devolved government and carried the agreement forward, which suggests that even had Trimble not been there, ultimately the DUP and the more hardline figures within unionism might well have been willing to agree to this deal. So the question of agency is a complicated one with respect to the 98 agreement. Similarly, if you look at some of the other figures who tend to be singled out for being the indispensable person in the agreement, whether it's Blair as British Prime Minister, whether it's George Mitchell as the negotiators, one can see that it's possible to imagine others in their position who would not have been successful in bringing about the agreement in the time and manner that it did. On the other hand, is this just a question of a matter of months, weeks, maybe even a year, and the agreement ultimately would have come about? So why does it matter? I mean, at the end of the day, the question is, does any of this matter? I mean, it's kind of interesting to know and speculate about whether any of these things make a difference. But the question is, does it matter? And I think here the answer is it does matter. And it matters not just because we want to understand what happened, but as many of you who've listened to me, I always manage to find a way to sneak into my talks my favorite little aphorism, which is from Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which is his famous statement that up till now philosophers have only sought to explain the world. The point is to change it. And the reason we try to understand the role of individuals in agency here is because we are trying to think as practitioners, what can we do to change the world? And here, the question about the role of individuals, both in this process and then thinking about the roles going forward in terms of lessons learned, I think are quite important. Because when you think about the account that I've studied here and then the political science literature on this whole question of conflict, one of the key issues, and that's been written about extensively, is this whole question of ripeness. And it's a rich concept on one level because it seems to describe and help us understand the phenomenon that we saw in the Northern Ireland case, which is why was an agreement, this very agreement, not possible in 1973, but possible in 1998, which suggests it was, quote, not ripe in 1973. It was ripe in 1998. But the question becomes for the practitioner, as opposed to the historian, well, okay, yes, and it's all well and good in retrospect to say, yes, it was ripe in 1998, but how do you know when something is ripe? And as a practitioner, what would lead you to believe? Or do you just keep trying all the time and keep going until it finally happens? You could say, well, maybe that's an option, but one, time and space is limited. You can't keep trying everything all the time. You have a lot of things that you might do. You might be doing peace deals in other places. You might be trying to do other things. And so you are ultimately making a judgment, is this a good moment to start a peace agreement? And as many of you know, this is always the debate on issues like the Israel-Palestinian question. Is this a good time? Was it a good time when, how did Jimmy Carter know it was a good time to convene Camp David? And was Clinton wrong in when he convened his Camp David meeting in 2000? Did he fail because it was not ripe? The same is true for efforts under President Bush 43 when he tried to solve them. Are there some ways that we can know as practitioners from these experiences when the situation is ripe? Because if we can't, then this idea of ripeness seems all well and good, but it's not news you can use, right? I mean, it's just a kind of a fitting the curve backwards into a set of things where you're retrodicting, but you can't predict that an intervention is ripe. And I think that's one of the key challenges where the historians and the practitioners need to come together, and the political scientists, are there ways of knowing and looking at these cases that would help us to understand what leads to ripeness. So the second concept that political scientists have come up with is this idea of a herding stalemate. It's another one of the favorite terms in the literature. But again, the question is, how do you know, right? I mean, the theory of a herding stalemate is that people have reached a point where they think the cost of continuing the conflict is greater than the cost of reaching an agreement. But in the case of Northern Ireland, the parties were divided. And so within the Republican movement, within the IRA, many of the leaders thought it was not the case, that they thought they could continue the fight, and they thought it was worth continuing the fight. And it was certainly worth continuing the fight given what the hardliners felt was a very unsatisfactory set of concessions that Adams and McGuinness had won. After all, the point of the Republican movement was to get a unified Ireland, right? And they didn't get it, right? So, I mean, to say that there was a herding stalemate that made it worse tough fighting, From the perspective of the people who dissented, who became part of the dissident movements, the real IRA, the answer was there was no herding stalemate, that they were ready to carry on the fight. And similarly, within the unionist movement, there were many, including those who left the party at Trimble's decision to make these compromises, to sit down and power share with terrorists. So was there a herding stalemate or not? In the views of some, yes. In the views of others, no. The people who had come to be able to make the agreement may have thought that they were better off reaching the agreement. But would it be possible, stepping back from this, to know, looking at the landscape, that this was the case? I think the answer is it's very difficult. So again, the question is, how much does this understanding and sort of tracking this particular story help us as practitioners go forward in the other cases? And I think what we learn is that these are heuristics, right? And this is why I think a lot of the discussion from this morning is so important, which is we can see some characteristics of the situation that would lead you to believe it's worth trying, right? But would never lead you to believe that, to know that it's going to work, right? And that's the difference between the practitioner, I think, and the political scientist, is that the practitioner isn't looking for a certainty that we've reached a situation in which the agreement will work. We're rather looking for some indicia, where some of the characteristics that would say it's worth trying now. There's a risk that you're going to fail, but you have to make the decision about whether there's some chance. I mean, whether you assign a probability to it or not, as many of you know, I'm very skeptical about the sort of the false kind of concreteness of giving probabilities to non-probabilistic events. But there are a sense in which this is promising, this is unpromising, or these are the characteristics of the situation. And this is where history helps us, because history doesn't have to give us a definitive answer about under what circumstances have you reached the herding stalemate, under what circumstances it's ripe. It's simply what kinds of things might you look for that would suggest that it's worth doing, right? And there, I think, is the power of understanding the story, which is that the individuals in the agency here were individuals who saw some of the features that led them to think it was worth trying. It's important to understand that it didn't happen immediately, right? There were a lot of false starts, even when the process really began to get some momentum in the early 1990s, that it almost didn't work. It almost fell apart for a variety of reasons, because John Major lost his parliamentary majority and became more cautious, and that affected the British willingness to talk to the IRA, and so the process stumbled. Difficulties that Adams and McGuinness had in holding the IRA together, which led to the Canary Wharf bombings, which also led to the process falling apart. And so it wasn't foreordained that it was going to happen, and it might not have. But the parties and the leaders exercising their agency saw enough in this to make it worthwhile. It's also important to understand that just because this one succeeded doesn't mean other ones would have succeeded, right? And we have other efforts at peacemaking, not just Sunningdale's, but the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, that all didn't succeed, right? And yet there were people at the time who perceived that it might well be right. And I think this is the important judgment, both the value of the history, which is to see the analogies not as predictions, or to say, as some would want us to do, well, this proves that you should always talk to terrorists, or that you should never talk to terrorists, but rather to see under what circumstance, why did talking to terrorists in this case seem to work, and what were the characteristics of the features of this environment that led to the British government willingness to talk to the IRA that made it work in this case, to help us think about whether it's worth talking to terrorists in other circumstances, whether it's worth beginning a peace process without preconditions, or whether you should have preconditions. Another one of the great issues here, or the great successes as we look at the process of Northern Ireland, was that once the decision not to establish preconditions for the talks, the process moved forward, and the preconditions on decommissioning and the end of the violence turned out to be a barrier. But it's not a hard and fast rule. It's just something that we can look at as practitioners. So bottom line for me is this is important to see the history, as long as you don't try to get too much out of it. And this, I think, is where the historians can help us And the political scientists can be cautioned by saying, you don't have to have a definitive answer to these questions. It can be suggestive. It can be, these are the kinds of factors to look at. Because ultimately, the study, whether it's of IR theory or of history, for the practitioner, leading back to Philip's wonderful presentation this morning and the work that he's done, we're not looking for the answers, we're looking for the right questions, right? And what you get from these kinds of studies of history is how to think about what the questions. What are the characteristics of a situation that makes it possible to think that an agreement is right? What are the characteristics of a situation that makes it's worth thinking that we should look for an agreement that ends the fighting even if it doesn't solve all the problems, right? Which is the nature of the Good Friday Agreement, which pushed a lot of the problems down the road, but did end the violence. And what are the consequences of having that kind of agreement rather than holding out for a more comprehensive agreement that solved the other issues? But I think for you all as political scientists, historians, it should be encouraging to think that there's value in this without trying to oversimplify the lessons learned and without trying to come up with conclusive answers to the lessons learned, to help us think as practitioners about what are the questions, what should we be looking for, what are the signposts, what are the alternatives that might help policymakers think about how they can carry out their work because of their deep conviction about the importance of agency. So let me stop there.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.